Everyone is calling their ex a narcissist these days, but what does that actually mean? And what can you do if you think that your spouse might be one? I'm Josh Fuller. I'm the co founder here at Marriage Mavericks. And over the last 15 years, my wife Cassie and I have helped hundreds of people heal their marriages and fall madly in love again. Now, most of our clients are fighting for their marriages on their own. They feel unloved, not good enough, like their spouse is blaming them for everything. In other words, they feel like their spouses are exhibiting a ton of narcissistic traits. And in helping these people, we've come to realize that most of the common wisdom about narcissists that's floating around on social media is just dead wrong. So in this video, we're going to talk about narcissism in a marriage, what narcissism is in general, what the red flags for narcissism are in a marriage, and most importantly, what steps you can take to get your marriage back on track. And let's start with talking about what narcissism actually is. Narcissism is often used as a slang, as a shorthand, to describe someone who's vain or self-involved, but the clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, what makes a narcissist, is more complex. So NPD is a personality disorder where people have an inflated sense of their own self-importance, and according to the DSM-5, a person must meet at least 5 of the following criteria to be diagnosed with NPD. It's important to understand that everyone has these traits in some amount. Everyone has some of these narcissistic traits. So something only rises to the level of NPD when these traits are inflexible, they cause a ton of problems in day-to-day life. And an awareness around narcissism has exploded in recent years. So since 2022, Google search trends, which tracks what people are searching for on Google, how interested people are in different terms, the term narcissism, the interest in that, has been rated between 75 and 100, which is huge. 100 is the highest possible score. There's groups on Reddit. If you go to a lot of the biggest content creators and you look at their popular videos, they might have hundreds of videos, and maybe the top 5 will be on narcissism. And this is a shift that we've seen as well, not just on the internet, but in day-to-day life. So I probably do around 100 consults a month. And I'm not talking about coaching sessions. I'm talking about consults, new people that I've never talked to before. And I probably hear people call their spouse a narcissist on 1 out of every 4 calls. But this does bring up an interesting question, because if we go back and we look at those symptoms of NPD, well, they're not particularly easy to directly apply one for one to a marriage. I mean, requiring excessive admiration, what does that mean in a marriage, right? Being arrogant, what does that mean in terms of a relationship? So when we're talking about narcissism in a marriage, we need to define what behaviors are we talking about. So at this point, we're stepping outside of the clinical definition of NPD, and we're talking about how people use the word narcissist in the day-to-day. So on the internet, on YouTube, when you're talking to your spouse or your friend, and this varies a bit because there's no manual, there's no agreed to definition, but there are some behaviors that most people will agree are red flags for narcissism in a marriage. The first is a lack of empathy and accountability. So a narcissist might have a hard time understanding why you feel a certain way or what they did wrong. And they'll often shift the blame to others and say things like, "I'm sorry that you feel that way," without really meaning it. They may be self-centered and dismissive of their partner's needs. They may have controlling or manipulative behavior and seek to control their partners through things like gaslighting or guilt tripping or isolating them from their friends and family or controlling their appearance or their time. Poor communication. So narcissists will often communicate in aggressive and disrespectful ways. They may resort to yelling or demeaning or belittling their partner, or maybe they go the other route and they use stonewalling and the silent treatment to punish or manipulate their spouse. They may lie. Narcissists are often chronic liars. They may be jealous. And when I'm talking about jealous, I'm not just talking about with other people, but they may be envious of their spouse's success and may sabotage or downplay their achievements. And overall, obviously these traits, they would contribute to a toxic and imbalanced relationship dynamic that would be very damaging for the non-narcissistic partner. So maybe you're hearing these things and you're hearing this list of traits in the relationship and you're looking and you're going, man, some of those sound familiar. Is my spouse a narcissist? And the answer to that question is, it really depends on how you're defining narcissist. Clinically, probably not. The prevalence of NPD is much lower than most people assume. Most sources will say somewhere between 1 to 5%. Now, does your spouse have narcissistic traits? Yes, there's a spectrum of narcissism, and most people, they fall somewhere on that spectrum without having NPD. Do they demonstrate some of those traits that people will say are red flags for narcissism in a marriage? Again, certainly. There's a spectrum of all of those traits in different places that we all fall on it. And here's the other thing that I think is worth considering. A lot of the traits that people use to label someone as narcissistic in a marriage are things that tend to show up more when a relationship is bad. So if we're talking about poor communication or lack of empathy or jealousy or the failure to take responsibility, some level of that is normal when a marriage is going off the rails. And that raises an interesting question. Given that most of the time we're using narcissism as shorthand for my spouse is selfish and a bad person, rather than talking about an actual diagnosis, an actual clinical condition, is that label even helpful? And I would argue not. I would argue that most labels tend to be detrimental in a relationship and that narcissism is no different. First, labels can be inaccurate. Unless you're a qualified mental health professional, you're not qualified to diagnose someone with NPD. And as we already discussed, everyone has some narcissistic traits. Many behaviors associated with narcissism can be present in other mental health disorders, like autism, or ADHD, or depression, or anxiety, or may simply be traits that don't necessarily indicate a disorder. So overusing the term narcissist, it can trivialize a serious mental health condition and create unnecessary conflict in your marriage. Second, it shuts down communication. Using labels like narcissism means that we don't talk about specific behaviors or wants or needs, the things that really make progress. On top of that, most people will consider you calling them a narcissist insulting, and rightly so. And how many productive conversations have you had off the back of an argument? I'm going to guess not very many. So if you're telling your spouse they're a narcissist, whatever conversation you're having, whatever you were trying to resolve, or whatever need you were trying to get met, the conversation is pretty much done. Third, and this may be the biggest piece, is you're assigning an identity to your spouse. And it's not a good one. Our beliefs are the lenses through which we interpret the world. And some of the most impactful beliefs you can have are what are called declarative identity beliefs. So these are beliefs about yourself and who you are as a person. They often start with or will translate to, when you really listen, to I am. I am a great spouse. I am a problem solver. I am loving. Or on the other side, maybe I'm someone who struggles with anger, or I'm not good enough. So you have those beliefs about yourself and who you are. But when you're in a marriage, you also have beliefs about your spouse and who they are as a person. They're a good person. They mean well. They're kind. They have your back. They support you through the hard times. Those might be some positive beliefs about your spouse. Or maybe you have some negative ones, like they're vengeful. They don't care. They're lazy. And identity beliefs, whether it is for you or for your spouse, or honestly, anyone else that you're in a relationship with, the reason those are so important and so powerful is because they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Let me give you an example. If you believe that you are a problem solver, then when a problem comes up, instead of getting flustered, you're going to take action, you're going to solve it. If you believe that you're not good enough, then you're not going to advocate for yourself. You're not going to get what you need, which is going to reinforce the feeling that you're not enough. And so when you're assigning your spouse an identity of narcissist, what are we really saying? We're saying you're an asshole. You're abusive. This is all your fault. And you won't change because narcissists don't change. Now, let me ask you, what kind of impact do you think that filter has on your interactions with your spouse and how you respond to them? Do you think that that's going to color your interactions? That's going to color your responses, your reactions. They're going to feel that from you. They're going to feel that disdain, that judgment of who they are, them being a bad person. And that's then going to impact the way that they respond to you. You're not just assigning your spouse an identity, though. You're also assigning yourself an identity. You're giving yourself the identity of the victim in this relationship. And this can prevent you from taking responsibility for your own actions and your own contributions to the issues in a marriage. And as we teach our clients, you only have power over the places in a marriage where you're willing to take responsibility. A marriage is a co-creation. Both of you have made mistakes and are making mistakes if your marriage is struggling. And if any of you have doubts that these beliefs are the kiss of death for your marriage, all you have to do is compare how people talk about narcissism to how they talk about other psychiatric disorders. So I have pretty severe ADHD. I was diagnosed as a kid. I was re-diagnosed as an adult. And we've coached a lot of clients with ADHD. ADHD is more prevalent than NPD. So 4.4% of adults. There's no 1% low range there. And it has huge negative impacts on a marriage. As any of you who have a spouse with ADHD will know, or as you will know if you have ADHD yourself. Emotional dysregulation, not following through, being reactive, walking on eggshells, blow-ups, financial mismanagement, being in a spot where your spouse feels neglected or unloved, or maybe like they're the parent and you're the child. There are so many serious issues and hurts that come from having a spouse with ADHD or anxiety or depression or whatever the case may be. But I challenge you to do something. Go online or go to Reddit or go to Google or go to Facebook and search for marriage and ADHD. Read some of those posts and some of the responses, and then search for marriage and narcissism. The attitudes, the questions, the responses are night and day, right? When we're talking about ADHD, you have a ton of people like, hey, my spouse has this problem. How do we fix it? How do I make them understand? How do we fix the scheduling? How can I overcome these feelings? Maybe it's not ADHD. Maybe they're misbehaving. How can I get them to lock the door? How can I set better boundaries? How can I get them to go to therapy with me, right? How can I get them to do household work? Now, you go to a group or a space where people are talking about narcissism in marriage, and it is, again, completely different. Because, again, a narcissist is a horrible person who will not change. They're abusive, and nothing's going to be better. And the only way to fix things is to leave. If I had a penny for every time I've seen this piece of how do I save my marriage with a narcissist, and the answer is you don't want to, or you shouldn't, or you can't, I would have a lot of pennies. And I want to be clear on something here. For some tiny fraction of the people watching this, your spouse truly is a horrible, manipulative, abusive person. I've had thousands of coaching conversations, as I said. I was in law enforcement for 15 years before that, working violent crimes. So I have seen and heard the worst of what humans do to each other. And I understand that there are some truly horrible, abusive situations out there. And if you're in that spot, my heart goes out to you. And you should leave. And you should find whatever help and support that you need to make that break and to make it safe for you. But I also know that most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, we're talking about two people who care about each other, who are doing the best that they can, and who just never learned how to communicate their needs or resolve conflict or support each other. And in those situations, thinking your spouse is a narcissist, it's really just a response to hopelessness. It's just a way for you to explain why the things that you have tried haven't worked. So if you want to fix your marriage and your spouse is exhibiting some of these narcissistic traits, what should you do that's going to get you closer to your goal of a happy, connected marriage? Number one, you need to start communicating effectively. And this starts with focusing on solutions instead of blame. When blame starts, communication stops, which is one of the reasons why calling your spouse a narcissist will immediately shut down that conversation. So this means talking about your behaviors, your needs, and your boundaries instead of talking about labels. The second is to give charity. When our spouse does something that hurts us or makes us unhappy, there are two places that we have friction. One is the effect that that has on us. And how that makes us feel, what that does to us, that's something that only we know. But the other piece is our spouse's motive. It's why they took the action that they took. And that's something that only they know. And so much of the friction in a marriage, it doesn't come from the actual thing that happened, but it comes from assuming that our spouse has bad motives for what they did. They were trying to hurt us or manipulate us or sabotage or take revenge. So let's say that you're in a place where your spouse told you that they would text you on the way home from work and they didn't. Well, you could look at that and say, hey, the motive is I'm not important to them. They don't care. I'm not a priority in their life. Or maybe they were even actively trying to get my hopes up just to dash me to the curb and to hurt me. Or you can say, maybe they got busy and forgot. Maybe their phone died. All of those are valid explanations about the same set of facts. But the story that we tell ourselves about our spouse's motives is going to have a huge impact on how we feel and we react. So, one of the hallmarks of a healthy marriage is the ability to give your spouse some charity, to assume the best about their motives rather than assuming the worst about their motives. So here are some examples of how you can apply this. Instead of going, my spouse is so self-centered, they always talk about themselves and never ask about my day, maybe you could say, my spouse might be enthusiastic about what's going on in their life and forget to ask me about mine sometimes. And I can remind that I'm interested in their day, and then I want to share what's going on in my life when they're finished. Instead of my spouse is gaslighting me and they're always twisting things around and making me feel crazy, maybe you can look at that situation and go, my spouse might remember things differently or have a different perspective on this situation because every single one of us has awful memories and never remembers exactly what happened. And I can try and stay calm and explain how I see things without accusing them of ill intent. We're probably both misremembering some details, and maybe we need to work on communicating more clearly. Instead of looking and going, hey, my spouse is trying to sabotage my success and they get jealous every time something good happens for me, you can look at that and go, my spouse, they might be struggling with feeling like they're not good enough for me. And they may need reassurance that my success, it doesn't diminish their importance in my life. The next shift that you can make is to own your part. Even if a given issue, it's 90% your spouse's fault and 10% your fault, which never happens, by the way, you have a part in every problem and every success in your marriage. And as we discussed earlier, you only have power over the places in which you take ownership. Anytime you look at your spouse and go, this is your fault, you are actually giving up your power and your control of the situation to them, which is not what you want. So instead, be accountable for your own actions. Take ownership of your contributions to the problem in the relationship and acknowledge when you were wrong and try to learn from those mistakes. And lead by example. Work on your part, regardless of whether or not your spouse is working on theirs. One of the best ways to get anything in a marriage is to give what you want to get first. So if you want your spouse to take responsibility and to make changes, then take responsibility and make changes. This is how you get your spouse to work on their part. It's not by the words that you say, it's by the example that you set. You also need to set strong boundaries. Strong boundaries are critical in any relationship. They help you feel respected, they maintain your self-esteem, they ensure that you're getting some of what you want and need. And while boundaries are always important, they're especially important in our romantic relationships. Where most people run into trouble is they don't understand what a boundary actually is. Boundaries are rules that you set for yourself. And a good way to conceive of a boundary is it relates to what you're willing to allow into your own space. What you're willing to allow into your own space, be that your physical space or your emotional or mental space or your time. And the key is that when we're talking about a boundary, we're talking about things that are entirely within your control. If a statement starts with you, that's probably not a boundary, but an expectation, which is an entirely different animal. So some things that people often think are boundaries that aren't are things like, you can't be friends with someone of the opposite sex. You need to respond to my text within an hour. You need to be respectful when we talk. You need to start spending Saturdays with me. Some things that are boundaries would be, hey, if we're arguing in front of the kids, I'm going to stop the conversation. Or I'll end the conversation if you're insulting or screaming at me. I'm not willing to continue, and I'll stop that. I'll walk away. Or I'm not ready for sex right now. I'm not willing to continue putting my paycheck into our joint account if I don't know where our money is going. Or I need time to process my feelings. I'm not willing to keep talking now, but I'm happy to continue this conversation tomorrow. It's that piece of of the things that are in your own space and control that makes a boundary a boundary. A boundary shouldn't require anything of anyone else. It should come down to you. And the last strategy that can really help is to seek professional help. Because while these strategies are powerful, implementing them consistently is challenging. And if you're at a point where you're wondering if your spouse is a narcissist, things have likely gotten beyond where you can heal them on your own. So seeking professional help is key. And a professional like a marriage coach can help you break free from negative patterns of thinking and blaming, learning how to communicate effectively even when emotions are high, developing, maintaining healthy boundaries that actually work, seeing your spouse's behavior or your own through a clearer lens, holding you accountable to making changes, navigating the tough moments when you're tempted to give up. And there's something most people don't realize. You don't need your spouse to participate to start transforming your marriage. Most of our clients, they create dramatic, positive changes by implementing some of these strategies on their own, even when their spouse isn't initially on board. The key is finding someone who can give you practical tools and strategies, not just a space to vent or an analysis of the past. At the end of the day, labeling your spouse as a narcissist, it is not going to fix your marriage. What will help is focusing on specific behaviors, communicating clearly about your needs, giving your spouse the benefit of the doubt, and taking responsibility for your own part in the relationship. Remember, if you're watching this video, it's because you want to save your marriage. And that means choosing hope over hopelessness, choosing to believe that a change is possible, and most importantly, choosing to take action rather than just applying labels. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe for more marriage advice. And if you're ready to take the next step in transforming your marriage, click the link below.